All right. Welcome everyone to today's Pursuant webinar. Today is Wednesday, June 3rd, and we're going to be hopping on with a great partner today, Feeding America. And so I'm excited for everyone to get to experience this presentation. If you've got a question, you can go ahead and enter that in the Q&A panel, and we will be addressing those questions throughout the webinar as well as some reserved time at the end. We're also going to be recording today's session and sharing it out tomorrow in our follow-up correspondence. So if you have to jump early, or if you have some connection issues, or you were hoping to have some of your colleagues join but they weren't able to, no worries, you'll be able to share that recording with them tomorrow. And the voice you're hearing today is that of Leah Davenport. That's my photo over there on the far right of the slide. And I serve as the Senior Marketing Manager here at Pursuant. And I'm excited about the two guests that we have joining us today. The first of which is Hillary Noon, our Executive Vice President of Analytics, Insight, and Experience. Hillary, welcome.
Thanks, Leah. Really happy to be here today and to be able to talk about this topic with all of you and with our guest presenter, Angelique. I lead our Analytics, Insight, and Experience practice, as Leah mentioned, responsible for working with all of our clients on everything data, as well as overseeing our technology platform. So I've been here about 5 years, and prior to that was with the American Cancer Society, also overseeing insights and analytics. So really looking forward to having this dialogue. Would love for my colleague here, Angelique, to introduce herself as well.
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Angelique Chao again, and I head up the Performance Analytics and Insights team here at Feeding America, and we work with the marketing and fundraising teams on basically all of their analytics needs. I have been with Feeding America for about 1.5 years and came to Feeding America with experience, lots of experience in the retail and consumer goods sector, most recently in analytics for a big retailer out there. So happy to be here today to share what I've learned so far.
Excellent. So I know you've all probably been on a lot of webinars lately, listening to podcasts and reading content related to the pandemic and its effects on fundraising and just economy at large. And I would imagine that many of you kind of made it through that initial stage of the hectic reaction and are now settling into a little bit more of a new normal. Many of those same tenets that were important for philanthropy before all of this are, of course, still important today, which many of you can relate to: meeting donors' needs, meeting them where they are, being able to understand and respond to them in a way that is relevant. That's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today in terms of understanding those key metrics that help us gain insight into how we're performing as an organization. And in this particular time, I think all of us are grappling for what are those key metrics that will guide us most appropriately, and have they changed? And then even more importantly, how do I plan for what's next? And of course, there's no crystal ball, but I think having some feedback and some guidance and some real life tips and tricks from a colleague like Angelique is going to be really helpful for all of you to kind of go back and think about how that affects the work that you're doing, and at least begin a discussion. So there's a few different resources that we want to make sure to call out for you. Some of these you may be aware of, but if not, it can continue to add to your repertoire of reference documents to help you through this planning process. The first is our Pursuant Giving DNA platform, which we offer free trials accessible through givingdna.pursuant.com. You can load your data, your constituent data and your giving data, and you have access to third-party information that can help you understand how different segments are reacting during this time and then plan accordingly. There's also a few external documents, or I should say benchmark and reporting tools that are really helpful. We reference and leverage with our clients as well. The Fundraising Effectiveness Project is available via the AHP website. And there you can also load in some key metrics and look at some things as it pertains to your organization. For those of you who focus in on direct response, Blackbaud's Donor Centrics Index Quarterly Report is also a super helpful tool. And there are a number of others. This is just designed to kind of give you a couple of places to go to continue to use as a reference point. We also produced a fundraising metrics guide that came following our most recent webinar, Volume 1, which many of you should have gotten access to, and if not, we have that available on our site. And after today's webinar, we will also be producing the next volume of this guide and make that available to all of you. So as I mentioned, this is the second in a webinar series that we're doing on measuring the next normal. Hopefully many of you caught Matthew's webinar, which was establishing your baseline. This was a couple weeks ago, and that was intended to really get you thinking about the key metrics that are most important right now, and how that can help guide where you are on your path to either recovery or planning ahead for additional changes that might affect your organization's fundraising efforts. Today, we are going to be hearing from Angelique about how she is navigating these uncertain times at Feeding America, certainly an organization that is on the front lines of all of this. And so I think you're going to get a lot from today's conversation. Following today, in a few weeks, we then are going to round out this series with a webinar from our VP of Analytics, Suchi Ota. She's going to take this a little bit deeper for those of you who want to look at not just those kind of direct metrics that we're all very familiar with, but also indirect impacts. So what are some of the things that are leading indicators of behaviors that might be influencing how people are going to end up responding? And so she's going to go a little bit into that, not just from a regular reporting standpoint, but also how that feeds into forecasting and planning. So lots of opportunities to continue to provide you with resources as you are thinking of your own programs, both currently and for the next 6 to 12 months. So without further ado, I am going to hand over the mic to our key presenter, Angelique.
Perfect, thank you. So let me share my screen. Let's see. We want this one. All right. So yeah, I wanted to start out today's discussion by just introducing folks to Feeding America a little bit. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that, just for those who are a bit less familiar with the organization and the mission. So, you know, I think in pre-COVID times, we really addressed the issue that there are 37 million folks in America who are food insecure, which is just a massive number, obviously, for our developed country. So our vision in that context is a hunger-free America, and we want to accomplish that vision by feeding America's hungry, excuse me, through a nationwide network of member food banks and engaging our country in the fight to end hunger. And so, sorry again, who are we? Who is Feeding America, and who is actually fighting that fight? So I work in the national organization, which is based in Chicago, but we are an organization of 200 member food banks who get food out on the front lines to over 60,000 food pantries, meal programs, food kitchens, and places like that who actually serve our clients out there. And so, again, pre-COVID, we served more than 40 million Americans annually with food that they needed. So I did want to just touch really briefly on how things have changed on that side, on the side of our mission since the start of the COVID crisis. And some of these statistics here are things that you've all heard on the news. But 36.5 million new unemployment claims in the last 8 weeks. Leading to a huge increase, a 50% increase year over year in demand for food assistance. So there are a lot more people who need the assistance of our food banks and of the pantries and kitchens that we serve. We've distributed over 1 billion meals just since March 1st, which is just a massive number. And then to give you, a little bit of perspective on that, the amount of food that we source out to the network has increased almost 300% year over year. So absolutely a crisis that we are kind of on the front lines, as Hillary said, of addressing and of going out and getting to folks who need us. So having said that, and given a little bit of intro to who we are, I am going to focus the rest of the discussion on what we're doing in the midst of the crisis around being able to manage data, being able to bring analytics to the service of our goals for the marketing and fundraising functions within Feeding America. So just to give you a sense of that that fundraising side, this is old data, but it's pretty representative of the pre-COVID fundraising that Feeding America does. So you can kind of see our revenue sources broken out here, and unusually among nonprofits, we actually derive the majority of our revenue from our corporate partners. So those same partners that we partner with to access food and bring that into the network also do donate funding as well. So they actually make up the majority of our funding, but you can see there on the left-hand side of the chart, we do have a significant portion, almost a quarter each of funding coming from major gifts and from direct marketing, and then a little bit coming from foundations. And today's discussion is really going to focus on direct marketing. So how have we been managing data, and what analytics are we bringing to the fore to kind of inform how we're moving forward in direct marketing in this crisis. Having said that, this chart, when it's done for fiscal 20 and fiscal 21, will look very different because we are raising a lot of funding through direct marketing. And just to give you a sense of, how the monies that we are raising, how the funds that we're raising through direct marketing have changed since March 13th, which is a date that you'll see kind of throughout this presentation, because that's the date upon which we kind of launched our first COVID-specific fundraising campaign. And so that's when we define kind of the beginning of COVID for us, for fundraising. Since that date, our online revenue has been up over 10 times last year. So it has just been a massive, massive influx of support, which we're incredibly grateful for. But yes, it's been a sea change. The other things that are interesting are about half of that is restricted, and meaning it's restricted to being spent specifically on COVID relief. And that is very different for us and presents some differences in terms of the data that we collect and how we analyze it, because typically restricted revenue for the marketing department is quite small. So we do raise revenue around natural disasters, and we have done that in the past, but it's usually, maybe 5% of our revenue. So the fact that so much of our revenue is coming in restricted has some interesting implications for how we're analyzing that donor base, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then lastly, our donor base, of course, with this influx of support is bigger. It's also broader. So it's a bit different from the donor base that we had before, before this crisis happened. And we've looked a little bit at how that donor base has changed and what how we should respond to that and how we should be treating these donors differently from our existing files. So again, I'll talk a little bit more to that in a bit. All right, so with the massive influx of support there, a welcome challenge of donations, but philanthropy operations and data management, you can imagine with that sort of a change, our data systems simply weren't really prepared for that. They weren't built for it. Now, the good news is our website did not crash. And so, we were all crossing our fingers and kind of on pins and needles waiting to see what was going to happen there, and it didn't. So that was fantastic. However, our daily transactions exceeded the limits that we have to upload those transactions from our fundraising platform into our database. right? So we exceeded that kind of that daily data transfer. And the problem is for my team that we run all of our revenue and donor analytics from the database. So we didn't have the data that we needed to do the analytics that we wanted to do. So, what did we do kind of in this situation and how did we respond? A couple of things. One, we had to start running analytics from our actual fundraising platform, which we could do some of, but we certainly had some limitations there. For example, we couldn't like reclassify gifts into the right department that they were flowing into and things like that. And we just kind of worked around some of those, but we had to be a little scrappy and kind of get to know and use some systems that we don't normally use. And the other thing is we just had to acknowledge that, yes, some of our reporting was going to be a bit delayed. And so when we ran demographics on our March donors, we weren't able to deliver those until May. So there were things that took a little bit longer to get done. And, and we're currently in the process of running demographics on our April donors. So part of it is just acknowledging that, that we need to work with what we have. And of course, I don't say it here, but we did work with our partner to increase that daily transaction upload so that we will not hopefully have this problem in the future.
Hey, Angelique.
Yeah.
Would you mind, we just got a question, would you mind just touching on the platforms that you're using for analytics?
Yeah, absolutely. So our online fundraising platform is Luminate. So we use Luminate Online currently. And then the database that we use is called NGOC. It's a Salesforce product, which they are phasing out. They're replacing it with, another nonprofit database platform that we'll end up transitioning into, but that is what we use today.
Great, thanks.
Yes. All right, so that's a little bit of, kind of how we managed through those initial struggles. In terms of what we did differently in terms of, what data do we want to collect on these new donors, we had to update our donor segmentation. We decided that was kind of the best route forward. So the good news is we already had available to us project and account codes through which we could bucket revenue correctly into restricted, kind of restricted to COVID and unrestricted. So we already had that available, but we wanted to be able to segment the donors as well and not just the revenue. So we also designated a preference code for those donors who made their first gift to Feeding America through one of those restricted forms. And so they got this preference flag in our system, basically called CE. And that was fairly easy to kind of implement. But then we had a question because, okay, that's everybody that we know is giving because of COVID, because they're giving to a restricted form. We also are seeing, a 10 times lift in unrestricted revenue. So people who are just coming to the website and giving a donation to Feeding America. We know that a good portion of those is influenced by COVID because it's such a massive, massive leap from last year. But how do we designate which ones are due to COVID and which ones aren't for the purposes of segmenting them going forward? So we decided to create a preference code for them called CI, and we flagged them in our database. And we defined it as all new, so they hadn't donated to Feeding America before, new non-restricted donors who had given online since, as I mentioned, the start of our campaign, which was on March 13th. Now we know that this isn't perfect, it's overly inclusive. Some of those donors would have given anyway, even if there hadn't been this crisis, but it's kind of the best we can do for now. So that's how we're moving forward. And then there was also the question that came up for offline. So this is all online, the donations that we're seeing, but we did see a large lift in offline donations as well. There was a bit of a lag time to see that lift. And we know the lift is due to COVID. We still haven't quite figured out which or how or on what time frame we should be including those donors as kind of COVID influence, because it's not as easy because of the time lag to assign a particular date and say, okay, from this point forward, they should count as COVID. And now, they shouldn't anymore. So there are still things that we're figuring out. I just wanted to kind of share where we are in that process with everybody and what we're thinking about. All right, so that was kind of how we prepared the data. And now I want to move into a little bit how we're trying to use that data and how we're planning to use that data in terms of measurement. All right, so I'm going to share with you a couple of reports that we had pre-COVID and how we are changing or are planning to change them. So this first one is really an executive dash that we presented quarterly to our marketing leadership and the executive team. And we would look at, you could see kind of that top portion, just revenue, so unrestricted revenue to budget to last year. Then we would look at our donor cohorts, like the specific donors, as we like to track them, our new donors, retained donors, and recaptured donors, you know, and how many we have year over year, how revenue from each group is changing year over year. And then on the bottom, we have key constituent groups that we were following specifically because of focal areas or key strategic areas that we were pursuing in marketing. So specifically our high value donor group, our sustainers, our monthly donors, and then new leads. So these were, you know, the kind of things that we were tracking, kind of our highest level KPIs on a quarterly basis. So how is this changing now that this crisis, you know, is upon us? So the first thing is we previously had only looked at unrestricted revenue because we knew that, again, a very small proportion of our revenue was coming from restricted campaigns. And those donors are different. They don't retain as well. You know, for various reasons, we kind of said, okay, we don't want to include those in the very same analytics where we're looking at our unrestricted donors because their motivation is very different. The way that they act, how long they stay with us, all those things are very different. So we want to, you know, just look at unrestricted. Well, now that, you know, half of our donor base is coming through restricted, we kind of can't just ignore them. So we are going to be looking at this for restricted and unrestricted going forward. And we're kind of still in the process of deciding, are we just including them all in one bucket, or are we going to have kind of two different scorecards, one of which will be for restricted and one will be for unrestricted? But we can't kind of just continue to ignore restricted giving going forward. There's an interesting little wrinkle to that, though, when it comes to sustainers, because if a donor gives to a restricted form that says, you know, please help the COVID relief effort, we don't have a sustainer ask on that form, right? We can't do that because we can't say that, you know, your sustainer, you know, your monthly giving year over year over year is going to be designated to COVID relief. So we only have a one-time ask on that form. But that means that we can't just, you know, necessarily look at the same sustainer metric and say, oh, you know, what proportion of our donors are coming in as sustainers? Well, once we include the restricted donors in that pool, that proportion coming in as sustainers might look very, very small, right? Because they're not giving the option to come in as sustainers. So we're going to have to break this out a little separately and probably, you know, look at some things for unrestricted only, whereas other metrics will be including restricted and unrestricted. So things are going to get a little bit more complicated, but they need to, because otherwise the metrics just won't make sense. And then the last thing is new leads. So lead generation, you know, is something that we invested in prior to COVID. And this decision has not 100% been made, but we've been talking about whether we are going to invest in that in the future and whether we should flag lead generation as a KPI, you know, something that we still consider a key indicator of performance, when basically through this crisis, you know, we now, just by virtue of the crisis, have relationships with hundreds of thousands of more donors than we had in the past, right? Like, do we want to continue to invest in generating new leads, and how do we want to track that given this huge influx of leads that we just got? So we've been talking about potentially not having that as a key performance indicator moving forward.
Angelique, just a question for you. How many of the, do you happen to know how many of the COVID influenced donors were first time donors?
Yes, well, the COVID restricted donors, it's a very high percentage. I think it was 85%. The COVID influenced donors is also a very high percent. On the other hand, we always have a high, you know, there's a lot of churn in the donor base, so there's always a high proportion of new donors. But it's definitely, it might not be as high as the COVID restricted, but it is a very high proportion.
Great. And one other question for you while we were on this slide. Could you clarify your definition of recaptured donors?
Yes. So a recaptured donor is anyone who donates, for these purposes, would be anybody who had previously donated to Feeding America, but not in the fiscal year before the fiscal year that this is presenting. So this is presenting fiscal 20. A recaptured donor would be somebody who had donated at some point up to the end of fiscal 18 that had not donated in fiscal 19. And then if we recaptured them, they donated again in fiscal 20.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So that was kind of one high-level dashboard. Then I wanted to look at some other tools that we use. So we do have this tool, which again is updated quarterly and looks at quarters on a fiscal year-to-date basis. That's a KPI report. So you can't, I've kind of cut off the bottom here, but you can see what this basically presents here at the top. So you've got your fiscal years across the top, so that we can look at variance year over year. And then in terms of key indicators here, we split it out by donor type. So we've got our new donors and then a bunch of KPIs for them. So how much revenue is coming from new donors, how many are there, how many gifts, average gift, all of those sorts of things, right? So all of that for new donors. Then underneath that, we've got all of that for renewed donors. So those who were existing donors in the prior year and then are giving again, and then reactivated. So similar buckets to what you saw on the prior slide for that executive summary. So again, this is something that we have had historically and found very useful, but we're going to have to make some changes to it going forward. The issue with it is that because this crisis has occurred during the middle of a fiscal year, it's made the time frames kind of irrelevant up here. So, COVID happened in March, so it's going to be kind of toward the end of fiscal 20. So looking at these cohorts over time by fiscal year, you're going to combine COVID and 3/4 of a year of non-COVID donors into fiscal year 2020, and it's just not going to be meaningful to kind of compare that mix to prior or future years. So again, this is something that's still in the works, but we're potentially going to rework this, just starting with a year that would basically start at the time of our COVID campaign, so March 13th, and then comparing that to that same time period, 12 months prior, and then kind of going forward so that at least that is clean with like the start of COVID. Again, that has interesting implications because normally we do report on a fiscal year basis, and we of course tie our revenue and our financials on a fiscal year basis. So then, that creates kind of some interesting questions about how we tie our donor tracking to our financial tracking, which kind of has to be on a fiscal year basis. So anyway, things that we're thinking about and kind of noodling over here.
Angelique, one clarifying question on renewal rate. Is that monthly, quarterly, annually?
It's quarterly. So what you'll see here is in the first quarter of the year, that renewal rate will look really small because you have everybody who donated in the last year, and then how many have renewed just in the first quarter. But we compare it for the first quarter fiscal 18, first quarter fiscal 19, first quarter fiscal 20. So it's apples to apples across the fiscal years. And then, of course, as you get later in the fiscal year and you have more quarters in that, then you get closer and closer to a full year renewal rate.
Got it. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so now I wanted to talk a little bit about engagement metrics as opposed to, the donor and the revenue metrics. And some things that we're ramping up on during this crisis and that we're looking at more frequently. So I wouldn't say that, we've tracked these metrics before COVID, but we're looking at them more frequently now. So in terms of our website, a few things here. So on the top left, site traffic. So how many sessions we're getting per week, and that's fiscal 20 versus fiscal 19. So the year-over-year view there. And then to the right of that, organic sessions specifically. So those people coming to our site without coming from a paid ad or an email or anything like that. And then on the bottom left, weekly branded searches, and then the bottom right, weekly referral sessions. So, things again that we standardly track, but that we are keeping an eye on much more closely in terms of how those are shifting week over week. And then email engagement as well. So again, I think similarly to the website, these aren't new metrics for us, but now we're actually looking at them week to week, whereas previously we might have really only deeply looked at this maybe once a month reporting. So, of the new donors that are coming in, how many have given 2+ gifts, which we are starting to see as we get, a month, 2 months, 3 months into the crisis. And the number who are still receiving email, how many are clicking through, how many are unsubscribing. That's one that we're watching very closely to look at the unsubscribe rates. So yes, so just, kind of a picture of some things that are at the forefront there in terms of email metrics. And then there are some other deep dives that we are doing in response to particular questions that we've kind of raised since the start of the crisis. So the first one there, and I put them in terms of hypotheses, but our first hypothesis is that existing donors may lapse disproportionately due to income worries. So if you look at the donor base that we had before the COVID crisis, we know that some portion of that donor base is going to be impacted by the recession, is going to have job insecurity, those sorts of financial concerns. And so we are thinking that we may see a higher rate of lapsing, a higher churn. So we are going to evaluate churn and retention among our pre-COVID sustainers. And actually, now that we've been in the crisis for a couple months, we're right now looking at measuring that for the first time, now that there's been a couple of cycles of monthly giving to go through to see how many are actually starting to churn out. Our second hypothesis is that new COVID sustainers, because we are getting some new sustainers here through ones that are going to our unrestricted forums and are choosing the sustainer option, that our new sustainers may retain less well than sustainers that we've brought in previously. And why do we think that? Well, we know in the past that just general one-time restricted donors have retained less well than one-time non-restricted donors. So now we're thinking, well, maybe these monthly donors that are coming in through COVID may retain less well than prior monthly donors. Is that true or not? So that's something that we're going to be looking at. Again, looking at churn among our new COVID sustainers. We have to start that a little bit later because we need to give them time to essentially decide to stick with us or decide to churn out. And then the last one, those are specific to sustainers. The last one is about more about channel migration. So we've all heard a lot about how people's habits are changing now that folks are at home, either working from home or need to be just, staying at home. And that folks are spending a lot more time online. They're using apps and platforms online that they may never have used before. Everyone's getting more comfortable online. So we, our hypothesis is that our donor base will migrate to online more quickly. That migration has been happening for us already from offline to online. We expect that it will happen at an accelerated rate. And so that is another thing that we will be tracking. Not something that you track super frequently, probably once or twice a year, but that's something that we definitely will be looking at. All right, so that was it specifically for KPIs. And now I wanted to just spend a couple slides, a few minutes talking about demographics, because understanding what these donors look like and how they're different from our current file was definitely a high priority for us. So starting out with just some of our findings, and then I've got an example of how we actually looked at it to tease out these findings. But we definitely have found some key differences between our the new donors on our file and our existing file that are informing how we're kind of stewarding those donors. So the first one is that general COVID donors, and what does that mean? Those are the folks who donated since March 13th who are not associated with a huge event, because we did some sub-segmentation within the COVID segmentation. So you've got this big group of donors that started donating, they were new donors and they started donating on March 13th. We've also had several really big events, one of which was an iHeart special that was broadcast on Fox back in April, and end of March, I think. We actually wanted to break out that iHeart segment, for example, from all the other COVID donors to understand if there were differences between that subsegment and everybody else coming in. So when I say general COVID donor, that means a donor who is a COVID donor but is not associated with one of those event subsegments. So we found that general COVID donors actually are much younger than our pre-COVID donor base. Almost half of them are under 40, and that is significantly different, as you'll see on the next slide, from our general donor base. Now, the iHeart events associated donors in particular gave fewer large gifts than our other COVID donors. And so it was really interesting because we knew that right away from just, seeing the average gift levels that were coming in. And so an initial hypothesis was, oh, these folks aren't donating as much, like, should we invest a lot in stewarding them, knowing that, they haven't given us high gift levels? Well, what we found when we looked at the demographics is that when we looked at income levels, they actually had higher incomes and net worth than the other segments. So even though they gave lower average gift levels, they demonstrated that they actually have higher income and net worth levels. So again, that really influenced how we're thinking about those donors and how we're thinking about outreach to those donors. And in fact, the bottom bullet there was also important to us. Aside from the income and net worth, their demographic profiles of that iHeart audience was actually similar to our pre-COVID donor base, which actually makes it easier in some ways to reach out to them, right? Like we feel like, oh, we understand them, because in other ways they are actually very similar to the donor base that we had. So this is just one example of, visually the analytics that we did, and then visually how we looked at it and how we presented it to our marketing partners, just looking at age as an example. So, here you've got your age buckets mapped across the x-axis, and then you can see on the y-axis all the different kind of groups or segments of donors that we looked at. So the top one there is that general COVID segment I was talking about before. And then the second bar refers to the iHeart folks, so people who came in specifically that day as new donors that day for iHeart. And then the bottom three are what I would call benchmark segments. So our online pre-COVID donor base. So what did online donors look like before COVID? And then the fourth one there, online sustainers pre-COVID. So what did our sustainer base look like pre-COVID? And then finally at the bottom there, our offline file. And so you can kind of visually see here, as I was mentioning before, this top bar, this COVID general donor base, almost half of it is in that 0 to 29 and 30 to 39 age group, right? And that's very, very different from all of the groups beneath it, including the iHeart group, which also is a COVID donor group. So it was definitely worthwhile to break these subsegments out as opposed to treating all the COVID donors the same, or assuming that they were all the same. And that was really it on demographics. That was a quick section, but now I'm going to move on to budgeting and forecasting, and talk a little bit about, how we're trying to understand and figure out, how different this picture is going to look for next year based on what's happening this year. Our fiscal year, like that of many nonprofits, runs from July through June. So we are just finishing up the budgeting process now, and it's been quite a wild ride. So budgeting, of course, at any time, and particularly during COVID, is a highly scientific exercise for us. Yeah, not really. There's just an incredible amount of unknowns, right? And so we all know that we all know what we don't know, right? We know that there's a lot that we don't know. But we had to start somewhere. So we started budgeting for fiscal 21 by selecting a baseline, of course. So first, we have to figure out what fiscal 20 looks like. And how do we know what fiscal 20 looks like when we're still in the middle of fiscal 20? And it's just been, in the past 2 months, been totally different from any historical financial situation that we've ever been in. So first, we started with what fiscal 20 would have looked like without COVID. So we looked at our actuals through February before the crisis started, and we just backed into, we just basically, based on historicals, backed into what the total year would have looked like if we had not had the crisis. And then based on that kind of fiscal 20 without COVID baseline, we said, okay, if that had been what had happened and we had made the investments that we were planning to make for fiscal 21, here's how much we would have grown in fiscal 21. So here's what 20 would have been like, and here's what 21 would have been like without COVID. And then after we did that, we kind of layered on the COVID component for fiscal 20. And so, I don't think we had to do it this way. I mean, I think there are a variety of ways we could have approached it. There are lots of reasons based on timing and what conversations were happening with different teams, with finance team and things like that. There's lots of reasons why we did it this way, but not saying it's necessarily the best way to do it, but this is the way we approached it. And so, yes, so we layered on then to fiscal 20 what COVID has brought in. And we had to do this at a much more granular level of detail than we normally would during a budget cycle. So we typically we typically don't need to look at anything, below a monthly level. That's typically how we plan. But for this, we needed to look at a daily level. So it actually ended up being easier because of the massive fluctuations day to day and with these big events. It ended up being easier to look at it on a day-to-day basis than to try to just look at a total month. There was no way we would know what a total month looked like. So we actually instituted daily revenue reporting and revenue projections through the end of fiscal 20, so through the end of June. And so once we thought, okay, well, here's how we're going to end through June, we had to say, well, how much of that is due to COVID? So we assumed all the revenue incremental to last year was COVID and not merely, say, displaced from one month to another. As I mentioned, we developed the daily revenue projection through the end of the year, and then we needed to figure out also, okay, this is what revenue looks like through the end of the year, but what do we think our donor count is going to look like? Because that's really going to be the basis upon which we're going to figure out, what proportion of these donors are going to retain into the next year. So we needed to also develop a donor projection based on, given the gifts that we were getting and how many were, second or third gifts and those sorts of things, how many donors does that really work out to be? All right, so then we had all of that. We had our fiscal 20 settled, but then how do we layer in COVID results for fiscal 21? And this is where you have all the unknowns, and it's kind of purposeful on the left-hand side here that you see bullets and then sub-bullets and then sub-bullets, because in fact, there's so much that we don't know. And it just kind of, I think, visually underscores, how much there really is. So will there be a resurgence of the virus? If so, will that lead to a resurgence of donations? And if so, to what level? And when would that happen? Financially, how deep will the recession be? How long will it last? There's been lots of discussion on what the shape of the recession will be. We would like to be able to use the last recession as a data point to understand how we might respond to this recession. But actually, in the last recession in 07, 08, our revenue was flat and then slightly up, but it didn't decline at any point. And we know that's not the case this year. We're already seeing a decline after a peak in April. So we can't really model on that basis. And then questions around whether the impact will differ by gift band, sustainers, we talked about before, all of those things. And then what earned media presence will we get, right? We've benefited from a lot of earned media in the last couple of months. To what extent will that continue? So there's all those external unknowns, and then there's internal unknowns as well. What level of investment will we have? That hasn't been fully decided yet. And what will the return on that investment be? We expect that it's going to be better because we do, have that kind of brand presence out there, but how will it change our return on investment? Retention, we talked about retention assumptions. How will those be different for our new donors versus our regular file? And then restricted campaigns. If we keep restricted campaigns open and people continue to be able to donate through restricted forms, that has implications for things like how many sustainers we'll have, because sustainers can't sustain through those forms and all of those sorts of things. So there's a lot of internal unknowns as well. But having said that, you got to do something, right? Fiscal 21 in a nutshell, we started out with growth versus fiscal 19 only from retaining a portion of the new COVID donors. So basically saying, all right, we know we're getting this influx in fiscal 20. What portion is retaining into fiscal 21? But that wasn't super popular with leadership. They thought we were being, a little bit too conservative there. And to be fair, it's not realistic because we know that we will continue to get at least some level of new donors in fiscal 21. So, we need to count them, to some extent. We just don't know how many we're going to get. So we did go through the exercise of trying to figure out how many new donors we would get that were incremental from COVID in fiscal 21. Starting with the organic channel, as most new donors come in that way, and looking at traffic and conversion rates during COVID and how they compare to non-COVID timeframes, and assuming that we'll get some portion of that incremental traffic and those conversions, certainly not 100%, but some portion of those in fiscal 21 as well. And then using some ratios to apply those findings to the other non-organic channels. So that's, there's a lot of detail, but at a high level, that's more or less what we did there. and we're still working through the last stages of it. So the other thing is, we know and we've seen that budget has a lot higher visibility than usual. And because of all the uncertainty that we talked about before, how do we ensure that the risks are a part of the conversation, right? That we don't just hand in a budget number and then leadership says, okay, now we're holding you to that, and that's that. How do we bring to the forefront just how much risk there is and how much variability we expect to see? So we have been having certainly more rounds than usual, multiple rounds of reviews with the marketing leadership, with finance, with our executive team. There's been a lot more involvement along the way than there normally has been in the past. And we're basically, we're just detailing all of our assumptions. Right now, we've got a five-page Word document, so it's very detailed, laying everything out clearly so that when things differ, we can kind of point to why and which assumptions didn't actually happen. And so kind of lastly here, I didn't want to leave without speaking to people planning a little bit, because this has all taken, a huge investment of our time and the people on my team and the people on the, on the marketing team who've been partnering with us. Perhaps even, I don't know, like twice as much as it would a normal year. And yet, despite all of this painstaking work, it will be wrong. Like, our budget will be off. There is no way that we can control for all of the unknowns. So it will be wrong. And we just have to know that going in. And we have to plan for it. So we've talked about what the right balance in fiscal 21 will be between updating our budget and working on that and freeing the team to focus on doing a lot of the other reporting work, like all of the KPI work that we were talking about in the first half of this presentation. So, what do we do? And we've planned that what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate the variance to budget quarterly. And if our results are varying more than 20% at the end of a quarter, we're going to go ahead and issue a new forecast. Normally, we would typically do that once a year after holiday, but we're going to look at it quarterly, and we feel like that's a good balance. And then work with finance to just try to make the process as easy as we can, understanding that, it's never easy. So that was really it. I know that we've had some questions along the way, but wanted to open it up in case there are more.
Thanks, Angelique. And yes, we do have a few questions. And before we go to those, I do just want to further underscore your last slide, because I think that's really important. The fact that you as are a large organization, having someone like yourself on the team and with staff who can kind of dedicate to this, and for you to come out and say, hey, it's going to be wrong. There are a lot of questions that we don't know the answers to, and part of this exercise is about being open to some of that art in addition to the science. So thank you for making a point of that. I'm sure a lot of folks on the call can relate to that. And kind of along those lines, there was a question around just the sheer number of metrics. And can you maybe speak to kind of how you balance the need that I'm sure your leadership has to dive deep into every possible permutation of the metrics with the need to help keeping them focused on what matters most?
I can try. Yep, it's definitely challenging. It is, especially with the scrutiny that we're getting at this time, which we absolutely should be, because things have changed, and we all have a responsibility to watch it closely and to respond as we can. But yes, I think that the good thing is that we did have a kind of basis of KPI reporting to point to and say, all right, here's the executive dashboard that we use quarterly, and it has, it really has fairly basic metrics on revenue per donor and, versus last year versus budget and things like that, and a handful of donor segments, right? And so we had some KPI reporting that we could point to and say, all right, we can still use this. Here's some things that we need to change, but there aren't, the metrics that we have for the most part are still the metrics that we're able to use and able to leverage, and we don't need to track a ton more metrics. That's true on the engagement side as well. We already are tracking email performance. We might look at it more frequently, but we don't need to come up with a ton of new ways of looking at things. And I don't think there's been a lot of appetite for that. I think what there has been appetite for, which we're trying to manage, is more different donor segments. So, you know, like I was mentioning, even within COVID, there's like COVID, but then there's iHeart, and there's all, you know, these different events. And so there's a lot that people want to know about those. And so one thing that we're doing to tackle that actually is we're building a Tableau dashboard that will allow some self-service to answer some of those questions. So it'll allow you to go in and pick a donor segment as long as we have a flag for it in the system, or you could pick just the people who donated at a certain time and actually pull their demographics, so that you know, then we don't have to handle every single question, but that there can, you know, people can self-serve some of that. So you know, it is tough. Like, I'm not going to say that we solved that problem. It's tough.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Kind of that balance between the higher level and then the deep dive. So thanks for that. You touched on the iHeart audience, and obviously there's some celebrity aspects to that. There was a question about whether or not you're looking at or measuring in any way the impact of third-party celebrity endorsement. We are trying to. So we do have a platform that does track celebrity stories, and so it's Meltwater, tracks celebrity stories, and then tracks total impressions. And we've actually tried to do some correlations to correlate different sorts of stories that are tracked there to revenue, and we've tried to track it relative to revenue and also to just branded search on our website. And actually, we haven't yet found that correlation, but we think we're not looking at a full enough time frame to actually see the results. So we're still looking at that. So I would say, yes, we are trying to understand the impact of that, because we also want to help educate the executive team on, listen, if we don't continue to get these celebrity endorsements, don't expect that we're going to continue to drive the same amount of revenue. And so, so we're working on that. Great, thank you. Another line of a couple questions around kind of the new donors that you're bringing in. Are you seeing, or it sounds like from some of your hypotheses that you're predicting that you might see a drop off there with some of those. Are you planning on any new stewardship strategies specifically targeting that group? That's what the team is kind of trying to determine now. And I know that we've talked through, you know, mail cadence, for example, and we know that we're kind of trying to be cautious. And for all these folks who donated online, right, we haven't yet subscribed them to the full mail program that they normally would get, because we suspect that they're just much more focused on the online side, and so we're not sure that we need to do that. They are getting they're getting our kind of standard email stewardship, so they're not getting anything different from what existing donors whose email address we already have are receiving for that. So I think, you know, that's where we are right now, but we are looking at the demographics in particular and trying to see, okay, how do we target differently? Like, how do we target, you know, this younger donor base that we have differently? Yeah. Yeah, that definitely leads to a couple more questions that we had around the demographics. Certainly a lot of interest in that. Can you speak to the tool or the overlays that you used and whether or not they included ethnicity? Yeah, we work with Epsilon to get those overlays, and so they just, you know, we send them our donor files, they send us the appends back, and we store them in our database. And you know, we're the ones who do the analytics on that. And they do include ethnicity. So actually, ethnicity and urbanicity are two that we've recently added. So you know, and that's age, income, and we have religion, we have political voting preference, things like that. Got it. Perfect. And then you did talk within your hypotheses about the tendency you were thinking of being able to migrate more of your offline audience online. Are you actually targeting younger donors using direct mail, or are you finding online to be the primary channel?
You know, that question, it is precisely because of that question that we have not yet sent our full mail stewardship program to our COVID donors, because that's exactly one of the things that we feel like it might not be relevant because they are younger. So I would say, you know, the final decision hasn't been made yet on that.
Got it. Okay, perfect. A couple questions around your tools. You mentioned the databases that you use. Do you have a connector between your Illuminate data and your primary CRM?
Illuminate data and
your primary CRM database.
We do, but I am not the good person to talk about that because we have a MarTech team that manages that. Yeah, so sorry, I can't really speak to that one.
Not a problem. And then you mentioned in terms of the actual tools that you're using for your dashboards, is Tableau the primary tool that you're using?
I wouldn't say primary. We would love to migrate more onto Tableau, and we do have like 3 dashboards that are currently available on Tableau, and we're developing this demographic one to be on Tableau. So we're migrating as much as we can to Tableau, but I would quite honestly still say that the majority is still done in Excel, as for many, many teams.
Yeah, definitely. All right, one final question, and then I think we can start to wrap up. What percentage, and if you may not know this off the top of your head, Angelique, what percentage of your database in terms of direct response is offline versus online, and has that, it sounds like that's shifted a little bit with this situation?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how you define like our database, like all donors that we have had over the past 10 years, or are you talking, you know, about like our current active donors? But offline certainly is still absolutely much bigger, like I would say 3x bigger than online in terms of the donor, the size of like the active donor pool as of the last year before COVID. Now it's going to be different, right?
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you to the audience for all of your great questions. Lots of interest in this topic. And just for those of you who may not have picked up on it, we will be providing the slides and the recording afterwards. Angelique, would you mind advancing to the next slide?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again for all of the great insights and transparency, really also, Angelique. I really appreciate your time and being willing to share all of that with us. For those of you who may be requiring or interested in some help and guidance with your planning, if you don't have someone like Angelique on your team, and you're looking for help with assessing the current state and impact on your fundraising efforts, both now and into the near-term future, we do offer at Pursuant a product called a fundraising strategy assessment, which includes an assessment of your current program, a roadmap for growth, some consultation around putting that into practice, and access to our Giving DNA platform, which actually includes a lot of the third-party overlay data that would give you the insights that Angelique was just sharing with you that they have for their program. So you could kind of jumpstart a lot of those assessments and insights for your own program. So please, if you're interested in this, check out our website and we can follow up and discuss that in more detail. And with that, Leah, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Hillary, and thank you, Angelique, for your time putting these slides together and engaging with our audience on a lot of these pressing questions that everyone has. And just a few final announcements for everyone as you're leaving. We will be having our 3rd installment of this webinar series, which we're calling Measuring the Next Normal, on Tuesday, June 23rd at 12 Central. So I hope you got that saved on your calendars. We'll be sending out registration info for that in the coming weeks. And then we will also be sharing out volume 2 of our fundraising metrics series That is an ebook that should be also going to your inboxes in the next few weeks. And if you're not currently subscribed to getting our resources, you can do that at our website, which is pursuant.com. So head over there to check out more resources, and we'll also be posting the link to this presentation there in the next couple of days if you don't happen to see it in your inbox. Anyway, thank you again for your time today. We're going to be wrapping up with 1 minute to spare. So thank you again for joining, and have a great rest of your day.